Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are setting aside, well, really, the comfort blanket of conventional understanding. We're diving into a world model that fundamentally challenges the two pillars of Western thought, cause and chance.
It's a concept that it really demands a serious recalibration of how we perceive reality itself. Our source material today is a philosophical essay, and it reflects on these dialogues between two thinkers, Helmut and Winfried.
And they developed this notion they call overarching subjectivity.
Übergreifende Subjektivität in the original German.
Right. Beyond cause and chance. I mean, that's just a staggering premise, isn't it? For, millennia? Our systems, our science, our law, our morality. They've all rested on this idea that reality is either predictable.
Deterministic cause and effect. If you do A, B happens.
Exactly. Or it's fundamentally chaotic. Pure randomness, the roll of the dice.
And this framework comes along and proposes a third mechanism. Something subtle, pervasive, that seems to guide reality without actually predetermining it.
That's the crux of it. And this isn't just about, adding a little footnote to physics. This is about a radical redefinition of subjectivity itself.
We have to move away from the idea of the isolated self, that sort of introspective I. The model says that relationship, interaction, and, conversation are the actual fundamental active building blocks of reality.
And this force, this overarching subjectivity, they claim it operates from the smallest subatomic scale all the way up to, the level of civilization.
All the way up. It's a universal principle.
Okay, so let's try to unpack this enormous idea. Our mission for this deep dive is to really map out this philosophical terrain so that you, listening, can walk away with a kind of shortcut to understanding this revolutionary perspective.
We have to grasp why openness, fostered through relationship, is seen as the foundational state of existence.
And the most challenging part right out of the gate is just accepting that subjectivity is not what we've all been taught it is.
Not at all. It requires a really deliberate step away from the Cartesian legacy. René Descartes, he essentially locked subjectivity inside the individual mind.
Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am.
Exactly. He defined reality through the lens of individual introspection. This new model demands that we stop looking inward for the source of subjectivity and start looking at the dynamic space between individuals, objects, and systems.
So if subjectivity is not my internal monologue, not that conscious voice I hear in my head, then we need a crystal clear working definition. What is it in the context of this Übergreifende Subjektivität?
The fundamental conceptual shift is that subjectivity is decidedly not a possession. It's not something you acquire or inherit or maintain on your own.
So I can't say I have subjectivity.
Not in the way you'd say I have a car. Instead, the source material defines it as a relational layer, a field of active potential, an activity between agents.
An activity.
Yes, it is inherently interactive. It only comes into being. It only operates in the moment of living execution, in dialogue, in interaction.
Yeah. I see the immediate difficulty here. If I say, I am a subject, I'm claiming ownership over that state of being. But if you tell me subjectivity is something that happens between us right now, you're making it external and shared and kind of momentary.
It is momentary.
It almost implies that true subjectivity vanishes the second I retreat into my own solitary thoughts.
That is the necessary conclusion of the model, yes. Think of it not as a noun you possess, like a brain or a house, but as a verb you enact, like walking or speaking.
Okay, that helps. The walking only exists while the action is happening.
Precisely. And in the same way, subjectivity is the enactment of relationship. When two people are truly engaging, I don't mean just confirming what they already believe, but genuinely exploring a new thought, maybe even disagreeing productively,
right.
The resulting tension, the openness, the potential for something new to emerge in that space between them, that is the overarching subjectivity at work.
It feels very similar to, say, Martin Buber's I-thou relationship, or maybe concepts from systems theory, where the interaction creates new system properties. How is this model different from just, describing a good conversation?
That's a vital, critical question. Buber's I-thou is definitely a precursor. It emphasizes that holistic relationship. But Helmut and Winfried, they push this idea beyond the personal and the social. They want to elevate it to a metaphysical principle.
Oh, not just a human thing.
Not just a human thing.
Yeah.
Buber is focused on the depth of the human encounter. Übergreifende Subjektivität, on the other hand, suggests that this relational mechanism is literally the engine of reality at every single scale.
Okay, so it's not just a beautiful human moment. It's the structural foundation of the world.
Exactly. And in systems theory, an interaction can be purely mechanical, a lever hitting a gear, right? Here, the interaction must hold the potential for openness and for novelty. The outcome can't be entirely determined by the inputs.
And what's fascinating is how this definition was even born. The sources mentioned it emerged from the actual, seemingly casual, open-ended dialogue between the two thinkers themselves.
Right, between Helmut and Winfried.
They were looking for the principle that governed their own productive conversation, and they realized the conversation was the model.
Precisely. They were practicing what they preached, using the medium of dialogue to generate the concept of the dialogical world. Which brings us directly to why the dialogue itself gets elevated to the model of reality.
Let's elaborate on that structure.
Yeah.
We know a logical proof is rigid, it's linear. Why is the messiness of a real dialogue a better template for reality than the certainty of an equation?
Because reality, in this view, is fundamentally defined by potential and process, not by fixed endpoints. A dialogue is the core structure because it begins in a state of openness. It's defined by potential, not by necessity.
And it could go anywhere.
It could go anywhere. It moves through inherent uncertainty, negotiation, risk. And only through that process does it arrive at an outcome, or, critically, sometimes just an interruption, a momentary pause, or a creative turn you didn't expect.
That makes profound sense. You can never predict the exact outcome of a genuine, open-ended discussion. I mean, if you could, it wouldn't be a discussion.
It would be a script writing.
Right.
Exactly. And that movement from the initial openness to a temporary generated result that isn't a logical consequence, it's seen as a living structure. It's guided not by ironclad rules, but by the emergent needs and freedoms of the agents involved. It's an act of creation in motion.
So to nail this down, the crucial insight here is that subjectivity is inherently processual. It's not static. If I were just a static, introspective subject, I would simply repeat what I already know.
You'd be stuck in a loop.
But because I participate in this overarching relational subjectivity, I become a vector for newness. The space between us is quite literally the source of creative emergence.
And that has enormous implications for how we understand our own agency. I'm not merely acting out fixed internal beliefs. I'm defined by my continuous active participation in a larger, interactive, overarching subjective reality.
My being is a function of my relationships.
In a very real sense, yes. And this is why the source emphasizes that the truth of this model, it can't just be written down or formally proven. It can only be lived. It can only be felt in the moment of genuine interaction. Every truly meaningful conversation you have is a demonstration of this principle at work.
This framework works beautifully to describe human interaction, but as you said, the sources push this concept far beyond just sociology or psychology. They claim this relational principle is universal. It extends from our daily conversations right down to the fundamental physics of the universe.
And that's the most audacious claim. This is where the deep dive truly begins. Helmut and Winfried basically asked, if we want to find the universality of this model, where's the most fundamental, the lowest common denominator of this openness through relationship in existence?
And the surprising boundary-crossing answer they came to was the quantum level.
Yes. They seize upon the phenomenon of the quantum state, and they argue it serves as the most basic, the lowest form of subjectivity.
How so?
Well, at that level, states aren't fixed values of, say, position or momentum. They're only probable. They're undefined, inherently interactive, and totally open to influence.
So this requires us to use physics as a powerful working metaphor. Before measurement, a particle isn't here or there. It's a field of potential, a superposition of states.
A state of maximum openness in their philosophical terms.
Right.
And that ambiguity of the probability wave, that undefined state.
Right.
That's viewed as pure subjective potential. The transition from that pure potential to a fixed outcome, a measurable reality, only arises through what classical physics calls observation.
But the sources are meticulous about rephrasing that term.
They are. They insist it is not observation in the passive sense, but disturbance, or even more accurately, participation.
Now that terminology is crucial.
Oh.
Why the insistence on participation over observation?
Because observation suggests a passive, objective viewer standing outside the system. That brings us right back to the Cartesian subject looking in from the outside.
The godlike perspective.
Exactly. Participation, on the other hand, implies the observer is an active agent. They are entering the relational field, they are disturbing the potential, and by doing so, they are co-creating the outcome.
So the subjectivity isn't in the eye of the viewer.
It's in the active relationship between the potential, which is the quantum field, and the participant, which could be the measurement device or consciousness itself. The result emerges from that mutual living interaction.
So whether it's two philosophers discussing an idea or an electron being measured, the underlying mechanism is the same. Openness plus relationship equals a fixed momentary result.
That's the module, that's the core pattern. And if subjectivity, this principle of open potential realized through interaction, is effective at the smallest scale, then it must apply universally in the largest, most complex systems.
It's scalable.
Infinitely scalable. The overarching subjectivity stretches across all these layers like an invisible thread, unifying existence.
Okay, let's trace that thread upward then. How does this physics metaphor translate into, say, societal dynamics?
The mechanism remains identical. It's a shift from open potential to temporary stability, and it happens via dialogue. At the micro level, between two people, it's a conversation. The shared linguistic space is the relational layer, and the outcome is some shared meaning or a decision.
And between groups, like a neighborhood council or a business committee.
Then it's social exchange. It's coordinating actions, forming customs. The outcome there is a new shared behavioral norm.
And then at the macro level, between entire states, it's political interaction, negotiating treaties, defining alliances, setting international norms. The result is a temporary geopolitical stability.
Exactly. And in every case, the outcome, whether it's the location of a particle or the signing of a treaty, is always an emergent result of that subjective activity. It fixes a constellation that was, just a moment before, completely undecided.
This allows for a fundamentally different view of really complex phenomena. I mean, civilization itself, for instance. It's not the inevitable outcome of some historical materialism or a fixed divine plan.
Nor is it purely random chaos.
Right. It is the complex result of this overarching subjectivity, continually being negotiated across all these layers of interaction. It's like the collective discussion team of humanity.
That's a great way to put it.
This solidifies the philosophical core, and it really mandates that we jettison those classical categories we started with. We have necessity, which is cause, and we have pure chance. Where does this third principle fit?
It sits squarely outside them. It actively contradicts them. It recognizes neither deterministic necessity, the idea that the universe is a predictable clockwork machine,
Nor pure randomness, the idea that all events are just equally probable and meaningless.
right. So the third principle, the foundational statement of this entire model is,
Openness through relationship.
that's the proposed alternative. Reality emerges not from fixed structure or pure disorder, but from the dynamic movement between subjects, from continual negotiation and living interaction.
Which leads to that beautiful summary from the source.
The world is a conversation.
And if the world's a continuous negotiated conversation, then every act of genuine interaction we engage in, from voting to simply discussing what's for dinner, is a small act of world building. That's an immense sense of personal responsibility woven right into the fabric of reality.
It really is.
Okay, so if the universe is built on conversation, we have to investigate what communication truly means in this high-stakes context. It clearly can't be reduced to just, transporting data packets, or we're right back to a mechanical model.
Precisely. The sources stress that communication is fundamentally a world relation, not merely an exchange of information. If I send you an email detailing a fixed schedule, that's data transfer. The subjective layer is minimal, if it's there at all.
But if we then enter into a critical discussion about whether that schedule is right or if it's fair,
Then the subjectivity blooms. Overarching subjectivity creates the open space, the relational field, where meaning, understanding, or dissent are truly possible. But critically, they are never guaranteed.
and that's why genuine dialogue is risky.
It's incredibly risky. You might be misunderstood, or worse, you might generate a radically unexpected consensus you weren't prepared for. That risk, that space of unrealized potential, that is the subjective layer in action.
And this helps explain why this model intentionally eludes formalism. We can't write a mathematical equation for the creation of new meaning in a critical dialogue. It's inherently unquantifiable.
Absolutely. The source states explicitly that it cannot be formally captured or totalized by theory or an algorithm or mathematics. If you could capture it, you would have collapsed the potential space. You would have turned that processual verb back into a static noun.
But that's not a weakness of the model.
Not at all. It's a strength. The model is meaningful because it is experiential. We feel this subjective layer. You feel the difference between a productive creative meeting and one where people are simply reading prepared statements. The truth of it can't be calculated, but it can be profoundly lived.
I find that link between high philosophy and just, felt experience incredibly compelling. Let's scale this up now. How do these fleeting communicative acts coalesce into the massive, stable, complex structures we call societies or institutions?
This brings us to complexity and self-organization. And in this model, complexity is actually simplified. It's understood not as a set of complex differential equations, but simply as the coordination of living individuals.
Okay, so complex structures arise because agents communicate effectively enough to coordinate their actions.
Communication is the medium of self-organization.
That's the key.
That's it. Individual discussion acts, small agreements, shared phrases, accepted procedures, they interweave and become more stable patterns. Take the evolution of a company, for example. A few people decide to meet weekly. That's a discussion act.
Right. They agree on roles. That's a stabilized interaction pattern. They write a mission statement. That's a formalized linguistic structure. These individual acts stabilize into higher communication contexts: the working group, the institution, the corporation.
And the collective entity that results from all this at the company, the political party, the nation, becomes what the source terms the discussion team.
Yes, the discussion team.
Yeah.
It acts as a larger composite agent form of subjectivity that then coordinates with other higher-level agent forms. So when the German government negotiates with the French government, what you have are two highly complex, high-level discussion teams engaging in overarching subjectivity.
And this process is always through communication, it's always open-ended, and it's always defined by that potential for novelty.
Always.
So how does this definition refine the concept of emergence? Because traditionally, emergence is often treated almost mystically. It's the more that appears seemingly out of nowhere when a system gets complex enough. Here, emergence is demystified. It's grounded in interaction. It is defined as a mode of relation based solely on the ability of agents to communicatively relate to one another.
Okay.
And crucially, the agents retain their freedom. There is no compulsion to agree or to comply instantly, but there is the possibility of effect. That realized possibility, where individual freedoms converge into a coherent, temporary pattern, that is emergence. It is a pattern that arises from subjects freely choosing to engage and coordinate.
So if the coherence of these interactions leads to emergence, then the opposite dynamic, decay, must be the consequence of the loss of that coherence.
Exactly. Decay is understood as the equally fundamental dynamic. It is simply the loss of coherent interactions necessary to stabilize the overarching structure. When the subjective coordination fails, the structure can no longer maintain its complexity.
This gives us a new way to understand something like biological death.
Precisely. Biological death is viewed here not just as a mechanical failure, but as the collapse of the overarching subjectivity maintained by the living being. The immense coordinated discussion team of the organism, the communicative processes between cells, organs, and systems, it fails.
The conversation breaks down.
The conversation breaks down. The necessary interactions, be they biological, chemical, social, communicative, they can no longer be maintained, and the overall coherence just dissolves.
And applied to society, this explains the fall of empires or institutions. It's not just economic failure, it's a communication breakdown.
Absolutely. Societal dynamics often show decay when centralized communication fails. When an empire becomes so vast that the periphery can no longer effectively communicate or coordinate with the center, or when trust, which is a form of open communication, breaks down, the structure just breaks apart into smaller independent parts, lower complexities.
There's a hopeful element to that.
There is. The philosophy offers a hopeful perspective here because this decay often leads to reemergence. The newly separated parts form new, smaller, more locally coherent communication contexts. And this defines the constant cycle of rise, fall, and reformation in social, political, and technological systems. It's the constant attempt by agents to reestablish effective dialogue.
So the world is fluid. It's a continuous conversation producing these temporary structures. But temporary structures are very seductive. They offer comfort, predictability, and that leads us directly to the concept's internal threat, the danger of allowing a flexible result to harden into an inflexible rule.
Rigidity is the nemesis of overarching subjectivity. If the outcomes of communication solidify, if the momentary agreement becomes an unassailable dogma, then flexibility is restricted. The practice interactions and the resulting communication outcomes harden into a rigid structure.
And for a system whose lifeblood is dynamic exchange, rigidity isn't stability, it's the onset of sickness. It stops generating novelty.
This is where we encounter the phenomenon of saturation. Saturation occurs when a system, be it a specific culture, a bureaucracy, or even a personal routine, reaches a point where it only produces the already known.
It just repeats itself.
It just repeats itself. The rules are so fixed that new input, new ideas, new problems, they can't be processed or absorbed. The communication patterns shut down possibilities instead of opening them.
But doesn't society need some degree of rigidity?
Yeah.
I mean, we need laws, we need infrastructure, we need organizational charts. If everything is constantly open, we just have chaos, which is just chance by another name. Where is the balance?
That's the critical tension this model has to manage. Rigidity is only fatal when it inhibits adaptability. Necessary structures like traffic laws or basic physics, they provide the shared framework, the tempo and the key signature, if you will, that allows for coordination.
Okay.
The problem arises when the structure starts to view itself as an end state. When a system operates on fixed patterns of cooperation that are no longer subject to critical review, it loses the flexibility to meet dynamic external demands.
And the cost of that rigidity is enormous.
It's huge. Innovation and adaptability are fundamentally hindered. Thinking and acting, which should be fluidly connected, become separate tasks.
We see this most clearly in institutionalization. A large company running on a 1980s management hierarchy. It worked then, it's fixed now, and it becomes a liability when new technology arrives.
And it becomes hypersensitive to external shock. When a disturbance hits, a rapid technological change, a global pandemic, an economic shock, the rigid system lacks the adaptable, subjective communication processes it needs to re-stabilize. Because it couldn't fluidly shift, it risks dramatic decomposition or collapse.
Just like the failing biological system we discussed.
Exactly. It failed to have the vital, ongoing conversation with its changing environment.
So the key isn't to prevent structures, but to view existing structures not as fixed foundations, but as intermediate stages.
Exactly. The antidote to rigidity is the conscious and consistent promotion of reflection, critique, and open dialogues. The structure must perpetually be questioned by the agents who inhabit it. We have to maintain that dynamic balance.
This concept of dynamic balance is a bit abstract, but the source provides an analogy that immediately makes it tactile and visceral: the improvising jazz band.
The jazz band is the perfect working model. It's the living embodiment of overarching subjectivity in a constrained, creative environment.
Explain that.
Well, consider the interplay. You have 4 or 5 musicians. They're united by a common structure, a chord progression, a shared tempo, maybe a melody line. But their activity is defined by spontaneous interaction. They are constantly listening and reacting to each other.
So the subjectivity is not in the mind of the drummer or the trumpeter.
It's in the space between their contributions. The music emerges as a truly interactive living entity. The subjective activity is that shared, momentary space where they decide to deviate, to follow, or to challenge the existing structure. That's the relational layer.
And this interplay creates a dynamic, emergent structure.
Right. A new harmonic resolution or a rhythmic pattern emerges that was not written down on the page and could not have been predicted by analyzing the individual sheet music. This is emergence in action, catalyzed by relational freedom.
And the risk of saturation applies to jazz as well.
Oh, it defines bad jazz. If the musicians fall back on playing only pre-made, safe phrases, they're licks. Or they stop listening to each other and only focus on their internal performance, their introspection.
They stop communicating dynamically.
They cease to invent anew. The music becomes saturated, predictable, and stale. The goal, both philosophically and musically, is to continuously move into new spaces of interaction where every contribution genuinely opens up the dialogue, advancing the music and keeping that overarching subjectivity alive.
It transforms the act of playing from a performance into an existential experiment.
It really does.
So the ultimate takeaway from Helmut and Winfried is this modular universality of their model. The principles we see in a quantum interaction or a jazz improvisation, they apply equally to economics, culture, social planning. You don't need a massive, complicated world system to explain complexity.
Simpler principles of flexibility and relationality suffice. And this leads us to the final, profound implication. If the core of reality is a continuous, creative, ongoing experiment in communication, where does that leave traditional philosophy, which so often seeks fixed, eternal truths?
Is this a philosophy that in its highest form no longer needs philosophy?
In a way, this approach represents a massive shift. It's a movement away from abstract systems and fixed theoretical doctrines toward the practical, lived experience of communication and interaction. The sources call this Gillespie reflection.
Lived reflection.
Right. It views the philosophical task not as defining principles, but as maintaining the integrity of the process itself.
So philosophy transforms from being a collection of theoretical principles into a living, dynamic process, an ongoing critical experiment in maintaining open dialogue.
Like a permanently improvising jazz band.
Exactly.
It stops searching for the ultimate, fixed, universal truth, a search often characterized by the quest for ultimate rigidity, and instead it operates as a constant space for the unfolding of new ideas and perspectives. It's an exercise in humility, really, acknowledging that every current structure is temporary.
This sounds deeply connected to the revolution in linguistic philosophy, particularly the later works of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who argued against abstract definitions and for the idea that meaning arises in practical use.
That parallel is absolutely intentional. This framework draws heavily on the notion, often associated with Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, that language is a form of life, and meaning is generated through social practice. The rules of language, like the rules of reality, are not fixed external commands that precede the game.
So this leads to the concept that it does not need the rule to generate coherence.
That's the phrase. The rules are constantly in flux. They aren't derived from some abstract logic. They arise in the moment through the interactions themselves. They are negotiated, used, discarded, and reformed in real time through the living practices of the people involved.
This reframes the entire quest for fixed philosophical certainty as potentially a misguided act of seeking structural rigidity. The search for a fixed external rule is futile because the rule is always being created by the participants themselves.
It's an act of trying to stop the conversation. The essential thing is to grasp thinking and acting as vital, dynamic processes that are inseparably connected. This is a philosophy of thinking in motion, adapting to constant change, where the critical, open conversation is not just a tool for describing the world.
It's the very mechanism by which the world is continually brought forth.
It is the ultimate fusion of thought and action. When philosophy functions as Gillespie reflection, it stops being an abstract discipline and becomes synonymous with the flexible, self-organizing dynamism of life itself. It means the philosopher's role, and perhaps the human role, is simply to keep the dynamic conversation going.
That deep dive into Übergreifende Subjectivität gives us so much to reconsider. Let's quickly gather the key, actionable takeaways from the dialogues of Helmut and Winfried.
First, the redefinition of self. Subjectivity is not an internal possession, but a relational activity, a verb we enact in the space between agents.
Second, the identification of the third principle, openness through relationship. This is the source of all novelty and creative emergence, driving reality beyond deterministic cause and blind chance. Reality at every level is a continually negotiated conversation.
Third, the existential threat of structural rigidity and saturation. That occurs when systems cease to critically reflect on their own structures, leading to an inability to adapt and innovate.
And finally, the antidote, the ideal model for dynamic reality. The improvising jazz band, where flexibility, listening, and continuous critique are the keys to sustained, living coherence.
If we grasp the deepest meaning of this model, it tells us that our purpose is not just to acquire knowledge, but to actively bring forth the world in the shared space between us.
So for you, the learner, to integrate this model, consider this final provocative thought.
If complexity is simply the coordination of living individuals and decay is the loss of that coherent interaction, look at your own life. Identify one established rigid structure, a business procedure, a family rule, a fixed personal routine, or a long-held belief that you suspect is operating purely on pre-made phrases. What institution or routine is so saturated that it is inhibiting its own adaptability and needs a dose of Gillespie-mility? What conversation do you need to start? What improvisation do you need to risk to reintroduce that crucial dynamic openness and keep that system alive and evolving?
A truly open question to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into overarching subjectivity. Until next time, keep reflecting and keep improvising.